Welcome to Life Stories, where we share the most inspiring and transformative journeys. Today, we bring you a powerful story of resilience, hope, and the unwavering bond of family. It's a tale of a son and daughter fighting for the life of their father, a man trapped in a vegetative state, and the dedicated nurse who believed in the impossible. As the days pass and small signs of recovery emerge, the true meaning of love, perseverance, and never giving up is revealed. Stay with us as we begin today's emotional journey. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to begin the story. It was the first day of my new job as a nurse, and the weight of it was almost unbearable. I had just graduated from nursing school, and this opportunity seemed like a dream. However, the reality of the situation felt like a burden that was too heavy for me to bear. My mother was lying in a hospital bed fighting cancer, and this job, looking after a wealthy man in a vegetative state, was my last chance to afford her treatment. The thought of her struggles kept me awake at night, pressing down on me like an invisible hand. I had to make this work. For her. No matter the cost. I had no idea what I was walking into when I entered the elevator to the penthouse of the luxurious building on the outskirts of the city. The elevator doors closed silently behind me, and I could feel the weight of what lay ahead in the pit of my stomach. I fumbled nervously with the collar of the uniform I had borrowed. The fabric far too large for me, ill-fitting and foreign. As the elevator rose, I adjusted it as best as I could, trying to appear more confident than I felt. I had no place in a world like this, a world of opulence, power, and privilege. But I had no choice. I had to push through. The penthouse loomed before me as the doors opened, revealing a hallway so grand it seemed like something out of a movie. Persian rugs lined the floors, and priceless works of art adorned the walls, each one more beautiful and expensive than anything I had ever seen in my life. The silence was oppressive, and I couldn't help but feel out of place. Every step I took echoed in the hallway, reminding me that I did not belong in this world. I raised my hand to knock on the door, but before I could, it swung open. Standing before me was Ivy Blackwood, the daughter of the man I was here to care for. She looked me up and down with cold, calculating eyes, her gaze sharp and unfriendly. "You must be the new nurse," she said, her voice as cold as ice. "I hope you're more competent than your appearance suggests." Her words cut through the air like a knife, and my cheeks burned with shame. I forced a professional smile, though it felt more like a mask than anything genuine. "Yes. I stammered, extending my hand. "I'm Liam Foster. I'm here to take care of Mr. Blackwood." Ivy didn't shake my hand. She merely turned on her heel, her back straight as she motioned for me to follow. We walked down the hallway, and I could feel her eyes on me, assessing every step I took. I couldn't help but think how absurd it was that someone like me, fresh out of school, had ended up here in this world of privilege and power. Before we enter my father's room, Ivy began suddenly, halting in her tracks and turning to face me. "Let me make a few things clear." Her eyes were as cold as a winter's day, and her voice dropped to a low, threatening tone. "This job requires absolute discretion and confidentiality. What you see here or discover within these walls must never leave here. Do you understand?" I swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling in my chest. I couldn't afford to make any mistakes. This job, this chance, was everything. My mother's life depended on it. "Yes. I replied, my voice shaky but determined. "I understand perfectly. I'll do my best and maintain the strictest confidentiality." Ivy scrutinized me for a moment longer, as if deciding whether to believe me. Satisfied with my response, she nodded and opened the door to the master bedroom. I stepped inside, and the sight before me was nothing short of overwhelming. The room was more like a high-tech ICU than a bedroom. State-of-the-art medical equipment lined the walls, monitors, infusion pumps, ventilators, everything looked brand new, more advanced than anything I had seen during my internships. It was both impressive and intimidating. But the real shock came when my eyes landed on the bed in the center of the room. There, lying in the bed, was Mr. Blackwood. He had once been a powerful man, a titan in the business world. But now he was reduced to a fragile, pale figure connected to a myriad of machines that kept him alive. His skin seemed almost translucent, blending in with the white sheets beneath him. Tubes and wires snaked around his body, their rhythmic beeps and hums a constant reminder of how precarious his condition was. I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of compassion for him. He may have been rich, but in the end, we were all equal in the face of illness and death. His wealth and status couldn't protect him from the ravages of time or disease. Ivy broke the silence that had fallen over the room. Her voice was softer now, laced with a mixture of sadness and frustration. "My father has been like this for 3 months," she said, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. "The doctors say it's a vegetative state. But we refuse to give up." She looked at me, her eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears. "Your task is to take care of him, monitor his vitals and inform us of any change, no matter how small. Do you understand?" I nodded solemnly, the weight of the responsibility settling heavily on my shoulders. I knew this wasn't just about taking care of Mr. Blackwood. This was about his family's hopes, their fears, and their love for him. It wasn't just a medical job, it was a deeply emotional one. "Yes. I replied, my voice steady. "I'll do everything in my power to care for Mr. Blackwood." I stepped forward, taking my place at the side of the bed, my hands moving automatically to check the monitors and record the vital signs on a nearby clipboard. As I worked, I couldn't help but think of my own mother, lying in a hospital bed thousands of miles away, her condition growing worse each day. I thought about the hopelessness I sometimes felt, the overwhelming weight of knowing that there was nothing I could do to save her. I wanted to help her, to do something, anything, but I was powerless. But this job gave me something to focus on, something I could control, even if it was just for a little while. As I performed the checks, I felt Ivy's eyes on me, evaluating my every move. She stood across the room, arms crossed, her posture rigid, waiting for me to make a mistake, to slip up. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't afford to fail. The minutes passed slowly, each one marked by the soft beeps of the monitors and the quiet, artificial breathing of Mr. Blackwood. I focused on the task at hand, trying to block out the nervous tension that threatened to consume me. Finally, Ivy spoke again, her voice softer this time. "I'll leave you to familiarize yourself with the equipment and the routine. Dr. Holloway, the family doctor, will come by later to discuss the case in more detail." With those words, she turned and left the room, leaving me alone with Mr. Blackwood. I let out a long, trembling sigh, allowing myself a moment of vulnerability. For the first time that day, I allowed myself to feel the weight of what I was doing. It was overwhelming. I turned my attention back to Mr. Blackwood, studying his face. What had he been like before this? Before the machines, the tubes, the silence? What had he thought about? What had he loved? And what had he feared? I didn't know. But I knew one thing for sure: I was going to do my best to help him, no matter what. As I worked, adjusting the tubes and ensuring Mr. Blackwood was comfortable, I spoke to him softly, as if he could hear me. "Mr. Blackwood, I don't know if you can hear me, but I promise I'll do my best to take care of you. We'll fight together. I'll help you come back. Just like my mother. I'll fight for you, too." I wasn't sure why I said it, but it felt right. And for that brief moment, it gave me the courage to push forward, to continue with the work ahead. I had a family to fight for, just like he did. I couldn't afford to fail now, not when everything depended on it. I spent the next few hours tending to Mr. Bradford with methodical precision, ensuring that the complex web of machines and tubes surrounding him remained functional. Despite my years of training, The reality of the situation felt different now. This wasn't just another clinical task, it felt personal. Each beep from the monitors, each rise and fall of his chest, seemed to carry a weight of hope and despair. I wasn't just checking vitals, I was witnessing a life hanging in the balance. As I adjusted the 4-drip, I couldn't help but glance at the photos scattered across the room. Family photos in silver frames adorned the bedside tables, and a bookshelf filled with leather-bound books stood against one wall. The contrast was staggering. These were memories of a life once lived, full of laughter and love. But now, this man, Edward Bradford, seemed to be trapped in an endless sleep, unable to participate in the world that had once been his. "Mr. Bradford," I murmured softly, as I had done so many times before when caring for my mother. "I know you can't hear me, but I'm here. I'm not giving up on you." I didn't expect an answer, of course. But something about this place, this silent, sterile room, made me feel like I was part of something much larger than myself. It was as though I was the bridge between this man and the world outside. He wasn't just a patient to me, he was a symbol of all the things we often take for granted: family, life, love. I went through the motions, checking his temperature, ensuring the oxygen levels were steady, and logging all the necessary readings on the clipboard. But with every task, my mind kept wandering back to the same thought: how long would he stay like this? How long could he stay like this? I had learned early on in my nursing career that the body could be a remarkably resilient machine. But the heart and mind, the soul, those were different matters. How long before the family decided it was time to let go? How long before the machines would be turned off? And his family would have to accept that he was gone. I could hear Ivy's voice echoing in my mind from earlier: no second chances, no mistakes. Her words had cut through the air like a blade, making it clear that any failure on my part wouldn't just result in a lost job, but in something far more dire. If I made a mistake, it could affect the life of this man, this father, who was more than just a body hooked up to machines. I had to keep it together. As the hours passed, I fell into a quiet routine, my body moving mechanically through the motions of the job. But then, something changed. It was a small thing at first, almost imperceptible. I had been checking the monitors for the 100th time, ensuring everything was functioning as it should, when I noticed it: a slight twitch. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The stress, the exhaustion, it could have played tricks on my mind. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision. But there it was again. A finger. Just one finger. Twitching slightly. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. It couldn't be. He had been motionless for months, locked in this state. And now, this. I leaned in closer, watching with an intensity one hadn't felt since the early days of my nursing training, when every patient felt like a life-or-death situation. Could it be a reflex? A muscle spasm? But no. This was different. The movement was deliberate. The finger curled slightly, and I could see the faintest flutter of his eyelids. "Mr. Bradford," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. The room remained as silent as it had been for hours. The steady beeps of the machines the only sound. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing. Should I call Ivy? Should I tell her? I couldn't risk being seen as overreacting. If this was just a fluke, a muscle twitch, I would look like a fool. But what if it wasn't? What if he was trying to respond? What if this was the breakthrough we had all been waiting for? I glanced at the door, almost expecting Ivy to walk in at any moment. But the silence stretched on. I couldn't wait. "Mr. Bradford," I repeated, this time a little louder. "If you can hear me, please move your fingers again." There it was again. The twitch. Slight, but unmistakable. I was now certain. This wasn't a reflex. Something was happening. I stepped back and quickly called out, "Ivy, please. You need to see this." Something's happening. I couldn't take my eyes off Mr. Bradford's hand as I waited for Ivy to arrive. My heart raced. My breath shallow. The seconds felt like hours. Finally, Ivy appeared in the doorway. Her face unreadable. She looked from me to her father. Her eyes narrowing. "What's going on?" she asked. Her voice cold. Betraying no emotion. "What is it?" "I think his responding," I said. My voice barely above a whisper. "Look." Ivy's eyes darted to her father. And she stepped closer. Her posture stiff and suspicious. "What do you mean?" "Responding," she asked. Her tone sharp. "He's in a coma. A vegetative state. He can't respond." "I know," I replied. Almost desperately. But I saw his fingers move. They twitched. And his eyelids, just for a second, fluttered. He's trying to communicate. He's trying to come back. Ivy stared at me for a long moment. Her lips pressed into a thin line. There was disbelief in her eyes. But there was also something else, something that flickered behind the coldness. For a split second, I thought I saw hope. But then she spoke. "You're imagining things," she said. Her voice flat. Devoid of any warmth. "He's been in this state for months. He can't come back." She turned away sharply. Her heels clicking on the floor as she headed toward the door. "I'll call the doctor. You stay here and do your job. No more fantasizing." The weight of her words hit me like a punch. My heart sank. I had hoped, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, this man, this family, would see the truth. But Ivy had already made up her mind. She had already decided to give up on him. I stood there, frozen. The realization settling over me like a thick fog. I wasn't going to win this fight. Not now. But as I turned back to Mr. Bradford's bed, I made a silent promise. I wouldn't give up on him. I wouldn't give up on this family. I couldn't. The tension in the room was palpable as Ivy left. Her steps echoing in the silence. Leaving me alone with Mr. Bradford. I tried to shake off the weight of her dismissive words. But they lingered in the air. Oppressive and suffocating. She didn't believe me. And that thought stung more than I cared to admit. I had seen something real. And yet, to her, it was nothing but a figment of my imagination. I returned to my duties. Checking Mr. Bradford's vitals again. My hands shaking as I did so. His heart rate was steady. But there was no denying that the room had lost its pulse. Ivy's words still echoed in my mind. "He's been in this state for months. He can't come back." Those words felt like chains. Heavy and unbreakable. Tying me down. But I refused to give in to them. I had to believe what I had seen. I had to. For Mr. Bradford. For his family. And for my own peace of mind. I continued my routine. Moving between the machines and monitoring his condition. But my mind kept returning to the moment I thought I saw his fingers twitch. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that it wasn't a trick of the light. Nor was it some involuntary muscle spasm. There was intention behind that movement. It was as if, deep within him, a spark of life had been rekindled. As the evening hours crept by, the silence in the room seemed to press down on me. The hum of the ventilator and the steady beeping of the monitors were the only sounds filling the air. But they were comforting in their rhythm. In a way, they made me feel less alone. I was still here. And so was Mr. Bradford. Tethered to life by these machines. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there. Somewhere deep inside. Fighting to be heard. I began to speak to him again. Quietly at first. Not expecting any answer but needing to say something. To keep the connection alive. "Mr. Bradford," I said softly. "I know this is hard to understand. But I saw what happened. I saw you move. I know you're in there. Somewhere." My voice faltered. But I pressed on. "Please. If you can hear me, I'll be here for you. I'll keep fighting for you. Just like I'm fighting for my mother." The words hung in the air, unanswered. And I felt a momentary pang of doubt. Was I fooling myself? Was I hoping for something that wasn't there? I clenched my fists at my sides and took a deep breath. No. I couldn't give up now. Not when I had seen that brief spark of movement. There had to be more to Mr. Bradford than what met the eye. There had to be. The door creaked open. And I turned, half expecting to see Ivy standing there, ready to scold me for speaking out of turn. But it wasn't Ivy. It was Matthew, Mr. Bradford's son. Matthew's eyes met mine, and I saw a flicker of something: frustration, confusion, maybe even a little hope. His face was gaunt, dark circles beneath his eyes, as though the weight of the situation had been wearing him down just as it had been wearing me down. But there was something else in his expression, too, something raw, a vulnerability that mirrored my own. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low but filled with urgency. "Ivy told me you were checking on Dad. But I don't know. Something feels different." I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to explain it. How could I convey what I had seen, what I had felt, when even Ivy refused to believe it? But I couldn't hold back anymore. I had to speak the truth, no matter how implausible it sounded. "I saw him move," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "His fingers. Just a twitch. It was subtle. But it was real. I think he's still there. He's trying to communicate." Matthew stared at me for a long moment, his brow furrowed in confusion, disbelief clouding his eyes. For a second, I thought he might dismiss me, just as Ivy had. But then something shifted. His face softened, and he took a step forward, closer to his father's bed. His eyes lingered on Mr. Bradford for a moment, and I could see the silent plea in his gaze. "I don't know what to believe anymore," Matthew said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to think you're right. I want to believe that he's still in there. But I don't know." I took a step toward him, my heart pounding in my chest. "You have to believe me," I said, my voice firm but gentle. "I know what I saw, and I'm not giving up on him. Not now. Not ever. I'll stay by his side. And I'll keep fighting. We can't give up." Matthew looked at me, his face a mix of skepticism and something deeper, something almost like hope. It was fleeting, but I saw it. For a moment, he believed me. He wanted to believe. "Okay," he said quietly, after a long pause. "Okay. I'll stay, too. If you think there's a chance, I'll stay." We stood in silence for a moment, both of us looking at Edward Bradford, each lost in our own thoughts. It felt as though the air in the room had thickened with the weight of what was at stake. But in that moment, I realized something profound. The power of belief wasn't just about seeing physical signs of life. It was about holding on to the belief that there was something more to a person than their current state. It was about the fight, the will to survive, the will to live. That was what mattered. Matthew broke the silence, his voice quieter now. Do you think we're doing the right thing? Holding on? I mean, I want to do what's best for Dad. But I don't know what that is anymore." I felt a lump form in my throat. It was a question I had asked myself countless times since I'd started this job. What is the right thing to do? Was it right to keep fighting for someone who couldn't respond? Or was it more humane to let them go? "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I do know one thing. If there's even a chance, we have to take it. If there's even a flicker of hope, we can't just let it fade away." Matthew nodded slowly, his gaze shifting from me to his father. "All right. Let's keep fighting." It wasn't much, but it was a start. A glimmer of hope, however small, was better than nothing at all. As I stood there with Matthew, I felt the weight of the situation pressing down on me again. But this time, it wasn't as suffocating. It was different. There was a sense of purpose, a shared determination. We were in this together now, and no matter what happened, I knew I couldn't stop. I couldn't let go. Not when there was still a chance. I would keep fighting. For Mr. Bradford. For his family. And for my own mother. I would keep fighting. No matter the cost. The days that followed were long and filled with uncertainty. Each one a delicate dance between hope and despair. I could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing down on my shoulders. But there was also something else. Something that kept me grounded. It was the belief that I had seen a spark of life in Mr. Bradford. And I couldn't ignore that. Not when I had the chance to make a difference. Matthew had stayed by his father's side as much as he could. And slowly, we began to fall into a rhythm. Each day, we would check the monitors together, ensuring everything was stable, keeping an eye out for any change, no matter how small. Sometimes, we would speak to Mr. Bradford, telling him about the world outside, about how things had changed, about the hope that still clung to his family. But even with the small signs of progress, twitching fingers, the occasional flutter of his eyelids, there were moments when I felt like I was losing my grip. Ivy, for the most part, kept her distance, refusing to believe that her father could be anything but the shell of a man lying in front of us. She maintained her cold, clinical exterior, her gaze as sharp as a blade. But every now and then, I could see something flicker behind her eyes. I knew she wanted to believe. I could tell she was holding on to something. Something deep inside that refused to let go. But she didn't show it. Not openly. Matthew, on the other hand, was different. Each day, I could see him struggling with his own emotions. He would come in, hoping for a sign, hoping that today would be the day his father would open his eyes and speak to him. But each time, when nothing happened, it was as though the weight of the world had fallen back on his shoulders. It was heartbreaking to watch. I felt a deep empathy for him. He was torn between wanting to believe in the impossible and fearing that it was just a cruel fantasy. I had seen that same fear in my own eyes, mirrored in his. The fear of clinging to a hope that might never materialize. The fear of losing someone you loved without ever getting a chance to say goodbye. But there was something else in his eyes. Something that kept him coming back every day. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was a quiet determination, a belief that, no matter how small the chance, his father deserved to have it. I knew that feeling all too well. It was the same feeling that had driven me to this point. The feeling that I couldn't give up, no matter how difficult it became. And then, one morning, something happened. I had just finished my rounds, adjusting Mr. Bradford's medication and ensuring the machines were functioning properly when I saw it again. This time, it wasn't a twitch or a flutter of his eyelids. This was different. It was a movement, slow and deliberate, but unmistakable. His fingers twitched once more, and this time, it wasn't just one finger. It was his entire hand. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. Could this be it? Could this be the breakthrough we had all been waiting for? I leaned in closer, my breath shallow as I watched his hand move. Just a little. It was small. So small that I almost convinced myself it was a coincidence. But I knew it wasn't. There was intention behind the movement. I could feel it in my bones. Mr. Bradford. I whispered. My voice barely a breath. Can you hear me? I waited. My eyes fixed on his hand. For a moment. Nothing happened. But then, again, the hand moved. This time, it was more pronounced, more deliberate. Matthew, I called, my voice trembling with excitement. Matthew, come quick. Within moments, Matthew was by my side, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked at his father, then back at me, waiting for an explanation. Look, I said, pointing to Mr. Bradford's hand. His moving, his responding. I swear, I saw it. His hand, he moved his hand. Matthew's gaze shifted between me and his father. And for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Hope. It was subtle. But it was there. He stepped closer to the bed, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch his father's hand. Dad, he whispered. his voice cracking with emotion. "Can you hear me? Dad? It's me, Matthew." We both stood there, watching as his father's hand twitched again, this time with more strength, more purpose. It was as if Mr. Bradford was trying to hold on, trying to reach out to his son. "Dad, please," Matthew said, his voice thick with tears. "Come back to us. Please. Don't leave us like this." I felt a lump form in my throat as I watched the scene unfold. It was both heartbreaking and beautiful. The way Matthew's voice carried all the love and fear that he had kept locked away for so long. I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration for him. He wasn't giving up. He was fighting for his father, just as I was fighting for my mother. The room seemed to hold its breath as we waited for any sign of response. And then, slowly, ever so slowly, Mr. Bradford's fingers moved again, curling slightly, as if in response to his son's words. I couldn't believe it. For the first time in days, I felt something shift in the room, a shift from hopelessness to possibility. The fight was far from over. But this moment, this small, fragile moment, felt like the first step toward something bigger. It was a sign, a glimmer of hope in the midst of a long, dark tunnel. Matthew's eyes welled up with tears as he looked at me, his voice barely a whisper. "He's still here, isn't he?" I nodded, my own tears threatening to spill over. "Yes, Matthew. He's still here. And we're going to keep fighting." We stood there for a long time, the silence between us filled with unspoken words. The machines hummed around us, their beeps steady. But now, they seemed like a distant background to the real story unfolding before our eyes. For the first time since I had arrived, I felt like we were on the edge of something incredible. The journey was far from over. But now, there was a chance. There was hope. And for the first time, it didn't feel like just my fight, it felt like all of ours. The days that followed were filled with a sense of cautious optimism. For the first time since I had started caring for Mr. Bradford, there was something in the air that felt different. That small flicker of movement in his hand had ignited something in all of us, a renewed sense of hope that, despite the odds, he might still come back to us. I couldn't help but feel a shift within myself as well. The fight had never been clearer, never been more personal. And this time, I wasn't just going through the motions of my job. I was fully invested, body and soul. Matthew stayed by his father's side every day, more present than I had ever seen him. He didn't leave the room, not even for meals. And I could see that his presence, though quiet, made a difference. There was a certain energy in the room whenever he was there. He would sit by his father's bedside, talking to him, telling him stories of their childhood, recounting memories from their family vacations. I could tell that it brought him some comfort, even if he wasn't sure whether his father could hear him. But there was something about the way Matthew spoke, his voice filled with longing and love, that made me believe that, somehow, Mr. Bradford could hear him, that he could sense his son's presence. I continued my rounds with a renewed sense of purpose. Every day, I checked his vitals, administered medication, and adjusted the machines that were keeping him alive. But now, every time I did so, I was watching more intently, hoping for any sign of further improvement. The twitching fingers had been small, subtle, but it was a sign. It was a sign that there was still something there. It wasn't until a few days later, during a routine check, that I saw another sign. It was small again, barely perceptible, but this time, it was his eyes. The flutter of his eyelids. The subtle shift in his gaze. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to keep me believing. "Matthew," I called softly, my voice trembling slightly. "He's doing something." His eyes. They moved. Just a little. Matthew was at his father's side in an instant, his eyes wide with disbelief. He took his father's hand in his, squeezing it gently. "Dad," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Dad, can you hear me?" We both stood there, holding our breath. waiting for any further sign. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, slowly, ever so slowly, Mr. Bradford's eyelids fluttered again. His eyes shifted. Just enough to give the faintest impression that he was looking at us. Matthew gasped, his voice cracking as he called out again. "Dad, please. If you can hear me, open your eyes. Just let us know that you're still here." For a moment, it felt as if time had stopped. The world outside didn't exist. It was just the three of us, standing in that room, holding our collective breath. And then, unbelievably, Mr. Bradford's eyelids opened. Just slightly. A small, fragile movement. But it was enough to send a wave of joy and disbelief rushing through both of us. "Dad," Matthew said again, his voice now full of hope. "Can you see me? Can you hear me?" I could see the tears starting to well up in Matthew's eyes as he gazed at his father, his voice shaky with emotion. The hope that had been buried deep inside him, the hope he had kept locked away for so long, was beginning to resurface. I stood there, quietly watching, trying to keep my own emotions in check. I had seen the signs. I knew something was happening. But it was one thing to feel that something was changing and another to witness it. To see it unfold in real time. It was a moment of pure human connection. One that transcended the machines, the monitors, and the sterile environment of the hospital room. Matthew continued to speak to his father, his words soft but full of emotion. "I'm here, Dad. I'm not going anywhere. Please, don't leave me. We still have so much to say, so much left to do." For a moment, it felt as though the room had shifted. The machines around us, the heart monitor, the ventilator, all of it faded into the background. There was only Mr. Bradford, Matthew, and the fragile connection between them. And as I stood there, I realized something. I wasn't just watching a patient recover. I was witnessing the incredible power of love and family, the bond that could transcend even the deepest despair. The next few days brought more signs, small, but significant. His fingers twitched more regularly, his eyelids fluttered more often, and on one occasion, I even caught a faint movement of his lips, as though he were trying to speak. We all held our breath, hoping for more, praying for more. But there were also moments of frustration. Moments when it seemed like everything would stop. When it felt like we were moving forward only to fall back again. Ivy, who had been so cold and distant at the start, began to show signs of wear. There were moments when I caught her watching her father with a mixture of disbelief and longing. But her walls were still up. She would never admit it. But I could tell that she, too, was beginning to believe. Slowly, her skepticism was being replaced by something more vulnerable. She wouldn't allow herself to hope. Not entirely, but I could see it in the way she looked at her father, the way she lingered by his bedside, her hand resting on his. It was a quiet, unspoken shift, but it was there. I believed that in her own way, Ivy was starting to let go of the fear that had held her back for so long. One evening, as I checked Mr. Bradford's vital signs, I noticed a subtle change. His heart rate was more stable than it had been in days. The fluctuations that had once been erratic were now more controlled. I couldn't explain it, but I knew it was significant. This wasn't just a random change. This was progress. And as I stood there, watching the numbers on the screen steady themselves, I realized that, for the first time in days, I wasn't just hoping. I was certain. We were on the right path. Mr. Bradford was coming back. I turned to Matthew, who had been sitting silently in the corner of the room, his eyes never leaving his father. "It's working," I said quietly. His responding. Matthew's face lit up with a mix of joy and disbelief, as though he hadn't allowed himself to fully believe it until that moment. "He's really coming back, isn't he?" His voice was barely a whisper, filled with awe and hope. I nodded, my heart full. "Yes, he is." We stood there for a moment, side by side, watching as Mr. Bradford continued to breathe, his heart steady, his mind slowly coming back to life. There was still a long way to go. But in that moment, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. We weren't done yet. But we were no longer waiting in the dark. We had a reason to hope again. And in that hope, I realized that this wasn't just about medicine. It wasn't just about machines and monitors. This was about love, the love that a family had for one another. The love that kept them fighting, even when the world told them to give up. The fight wasn't over. But we were no longer fighting alone. And for the first time, it felt like we might just win. The air in Mr. Bradford's room was thick with tension, each passing day seeming to stretch longer than the last. The signs of improvement were subtle, but they were there. His fingers twitched more frequently now, and his eyelids fluttered in response to sounds, as if he were slowly becoming aware of his surroundings. Each small movement felt like a victory. Each sign that he was still there, still fighting, was a testament to the strength of the human spirit. But with every step forward, there seemed to be an equally powerful pull back into the void. Matthew, despite the flickering hope, had his moments of doubt. The longer we watched, the more it seemed that the progress was both fragile and fleeting. Sometimes the signs would disappear as quickly as they appeared, leaving us questioning whether we had seen them at all. And yet, there was something in the way Mr. Bradford's hand would twitch, in the subtle rise and fall of his chest, that made me believe. I couldn't give up, not now. Not when I was certain that there was something more happening here than anyone could fully understand. Ivy, on the other hand, remained distant, her mask of cold efficiency never fully cracking. She would come in each day, check her father's condition, and then retreat back into the safety of her own emotions. She didn't want to hope, but I could see the way her gaze lingered on her father's face, the way her lips trembled when she spoke to him, almost as if she were daring herself to believe. But she wouldn't let herself. Not entirely, and I couldn't blame her. After months of watching her father waste away, of watching the hope drain from her family, I understood her reluctance. Hope could be a dangerous thing. But for me, it wasn't just a matter of hope. I had seen the signs. I had witnessed the small moments that couldn't be explained away. I knew in my gut that Mr. Bradford was still there, still aware, still fighting. And I wasn't going to stop fighting for him, no matter how many times his progress seemed to stall. I had seen what love could do. I had seen it in Matthew's eyes, in the way he never left his father's side, in the way he would talk to him as though he could hear every word, every syllable. I had seen it in my own heart, in the way I refused to give up on my mother despite the grim prognosis. And now, I was seeing it in Mr. Bradford, in the small movements that suggested, just maybe, there was still a chance. It was one afternoon, as I was adjusting the medication and checking the monitors, that I saw it again. This time, it was more than just a twitch. It was a full, deliberate movement. His fingers curled into a fist. And then slowly, his arm twitched, as if he were trying to move it. My heart raced as I leaned in closer, my breath catching in my throat. Could this be the moment? Was he really starting to come back? I immediately called Matthew over. Matthew, come quick. Look at his hand. Matthew rushed to his father's side, his eyes wide with disbelief. I could see the hope and fear battling within him. But he didn't hesitate. He reached out and took his father's hand in his own, his fingers trembling as he held it gently. Dad, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Dad, can you hear me? There was no immediate response, but I could see the muscles in Mr. Bradford's face twitch, as if he were struggling to respond. His fingers, still wrapped around Matthew's hand, seemed to tighten, just slightly. I held my breath, watching in silence as Matthew continued to speak to his father, urging him to come back to them. Please, Dad, we need you. We're not ready to say goodbye. And then, Just when I thought the moment would pass, Mr. Bradford's lips parted, and the faintest sound escaped. It wasn't a word. Not yet. But it was a noise. A breath. A groan. It was something. And that something was enough to send a rush of joy through all of us. "Oh my God," Matthew whispered, his voice barely audible as he looked at me, wide-eyed. His trying to speak. I could barely believe it. I had spent so many days watching the same still, lifeless body. And now, there was movement. There was life. It was as if the impossible had suddenly become possible. I leaned in closer, my heart pounding in my chest as I whispered, "Mr. Bradford, if you can hear me, please, squeeze his hand. Just a little." The seconds stretched on, longer than they should have. But then, incredibly, Mr. Bradford's fingers tightened around Matthew's hand. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But it was there. His grip was weak, fragile. But it was real. Matthew's eyes filled with tears as he looked at me, his voice cracking with disbelief and joy. "He's here. He's really here. Dad. Please. Don't give up. We've been waiting for you." I stepped back, giving them space as I tried to collect myself. I had never experienced anything like this in my career. The connection between a nurse and a patient was always important. But this felt like something more. It felt like a family, a son, fighting for his father's life. And it felt like a miracle was unfolding right before my eyes. I watched as Matthew leaned down and kissed his father's forehead, his hands never leaving Mr. Bradford's. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I should have spent more time with you. I should have told you how much I love you. Please, don't leave me." Ivy, who had been standing in the doorway, watching from a distance, stepped forward. Her eyes were wide with shock, her face pale as she took in the scene before her. She didn't speak immediately, but I could see the way her emotions were shifting. There was fear, certainly, but there was also something else, something more fragile, more human. I can't believe it," Ivy said, her voice shaking. I thought he was gone." Matthew looked up at her, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "I think he's still here, Ivy. I think he's fighting for us." Ivy stepped closer, her gaze never leaving her father's face. Slowly, almost tentatively, she reached out and touched his hand. "Dad, can you hear me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. There was no immediate response. But I could see the way she was watching. The way she was waiting for something, anything. Her face was a mixture of disbelief and yearning. And then, unexpectedly, Mr. Bradford's fingers twitched once more, responding to her touch. Ivy's breath hitched. And for the first time in a long while, I saw her let her guard down. "Dad," she whispered again, her voice filled with emotion. "Please, don't leave me. We need you." The room fell into a heavy silence as we all waited, unsure of what would happen next. But one thing was clear: Mr. Bradford was still with us. He was still fighting. And we would keep fighting for him. We would not give up. Not now. Not ever. The road to recovery was still long, and the challenges were far from over. But in that moment, as we stood by Mr. Bradford's side, we knew that something incredible was happening. Something we could never have imagined just days before. The road ahead was uncertain. But the tiny flicker of life that Mr. Bradford had shown us felt like a gift. A glimpse of a miracle in the making. Each new sign, no matter how small, fueled the belief that he could come back to us. And for the first time in a long while, it felt as though the impossible might actually be within reach. As the days passed, the improvements remained gradual but steady. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic recovery. There were no grand gestures or miraculous awakenings. But the subtle changes were undeniable. His eyelids fluttered more often, as though he were reacting to sounds, and his fingers moved with more intention, as if trying to grasp hold of something. His hand would twitch at the sound of his children's voices, or sometimes, Just as I adjusted the machines, I could see a faint movement, as if he were aware of what was happening around him. The most remarkable part was the connection between him and his children. Matthew was unwavering in his belief. Each day, he came in with the same determination. Speaking to his father with a quiet but palpable love, he would recount stories from their past, telling his father about the things they used to do together, about how much he missed him. There was something in Matthew's voice, something raw and vulnerable, that I hadn't seen before. It was as if he had shed the protective armor he had worn for so long and was finally allowing himself to feel the pain of losing his father. But he wasn't giving up. And neither was I. Ivy, too, had begun to soften. It was slow, like the gradual unfurling of a flower. But it was there. Her skepticism had been replaced by something that resembled hope, though she would never admit it outright. I saw it in the way her eyes lingered on her father, in the way she hesitated before retreating back into her self-imposed distance. She was still cautious, still trying to guard herself from the potential heartbreak of false hope. But even she couldn't deny the progress. She had started talking to him, too. Her voice was quieter now, softer. And for the first time, I saw her allow herself a moment of vulnerability. It was Ivy who asked me one day, as I adjusted the drip of his medication, whether I thought he was truly aware of them. I could hear the edge of fear in her voice. The fear that maybe, after all this time, there was nothing left of her father. That fear was something I understood deeply. After watching someone you love deteriorate for so long, you start to wonder if you've been holding on to something that isn't real. And I knew that Ivy was still struggling with that fear. But I had seen the signs. I had watched the small movements, the subtle shifts in his gaze. And I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more happening beneath the surface. That Mr. Bradford was still there. That he was still fighting to come back. Yes, I said softly, not wanting to break the fragile hope that had taken root in the room. I believe he can hear you. I believe he's still with us. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine as if trying to gauge the sincerity in my words. For a moment, there was a flicker of something like hope. But guarded. She nodded slowly, her gaze returning to her father. And so, the days continued to pass, with each one bringing us closer to a breakthrough. Though we didn't know when it would come or what it would look like, the uncertainty remained. But there was also something new. Something that had started to take root in our hearts. Matthew began to spend more time in the room, as though the connection between them had grown stronger. He spoke to his father constantly, narrating his life, the mundane details of his day, as if trying to fill the silence with love. It was in those moments, when he spoke with such earnestness, that I could see the father-son bond begin to reawaken. Sometimes, Mr. Bradford would react. His fingers would twitch when Matthew's voice filled the room, as if he were responding to the sound. Other times, it was his eyes that would flicker, just enough to let us know that he was still there. Ivy was still hesitant, but I could see her watching with a mixture of longing and fear. She wanted to believe, but the scars of the past few months were still fresh. There were moments when I caught her looking at her father, her lips trembling, as though she were trying to speak to him in a way that went beyond words. It was one evening, as the light outside began to fade and the room grew quieter, that something happened. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. Mr. Bradford's lips parted. Just the faintest movement. But it was unmistakable. His mouth opened slightly, and for a moment, I thought he might speak. "Dad." Matthew's voice was soft, a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Can you hear me?" Ivy was standing by the door, her arms crossed over her chest, as if she were bracing herself for disappointment. But when Mr. Bradford's lips moved again, this time just a little more, I saw her eyes widen. There was something there, something real. Something we hadn't seen in months. "Dad," Ivy whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Please, don't leave us. We need you." And then, As if responding to her words, Mr. Bradford's lips parted again, just enough for him to form a sound. It wasn't a word, but it was a sound, a soft groan. The kind that escapes when someone is waking from a deep sleep. And in that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. It was as if time had stopped. And all that mattered was this moment, this small, fragile moment of connection. Matthew's eyes filled with tears as he looked at his father. His voice breaking. "Dad, we've missed you so much. Please, come back to us." Ivy stepped forward, her expression full of conflicting emotions. She reached out to her father's hand, her fingers trembling as she gently placed them on his. For the first time in months, I saw something different in her, something that resembled hope. It was as if, in that small moment, she had allowed herself to believe, if only for a second, that her father was still there. And for the first time, I believed it too. We were still a long way from where we needed to be. The road ahead was still filled with uncertainty. And the progress was slow, sometimes painfully so. But in that moment, I felt something shift in the room. We weren't just waiting anymore. We were witnessing something miraculous. Something beautiful. I could see it in Matthew's eyes. In Ivy's trembling hands. There was still so much to fight for. And as I watched them stand together, as a family, for the first time in a long while, I knew we weren't alone in this fight. We were in it together. And that, more than anything, was what kept me going. The fight was far from over. But for the first time, it felt like the light at the end of the tunnel was a little closer. We just had to keep moving forward, one step at a time. Days bled into each other, indistinguishable at times. The steady hum of medical equipment became the background to our lives, the constant rhythm that we had learned to exist within. But amidst the monotony, there was progress. We weren't just waiting for a miracle anymore, we were fighting for it. Alongside Mr. Bradford. And in every small movement, every twitch, every subtle response, there was hope. Matthew's presence was a steady force. An anchor in the storm. It was clear that the connection he had with his father went beyond the physical realm. He would sit by Mr. Bradford's side, holding his hand and speaking to him, sometimes narrating the events of his day, sometimes recounting family stories. The quiet strength he exuded was something I had come to admire. There were no words, no promises made, just an unspoken bond between a son and his father. A bond that seemed to transcend everything else. Ivy, too, had begun to show signs of change. Though her walls remained firmly in place, she came to the room regularly now, her steps slower, more deliberate. I noticed her standing near her father's bedside more often, her hand resting gently on his arm. She would speak to him, her voice softer than I had ever heard it before, but there was still a hesitation in her eyes, as though she feared that believing in the possibility of recovery would somehow make the inevitable loss that much more painful. I understood her fear. After months of waiting, of feeling powerless, it was hard to allow herself the luxury of hope. But in the quiet moments when no one else was around, I saw a glimpse of something in her eyes, a flicker of faith. Fragile but growing. One morning, as I entered the room, I was greeted by the sight of Matthew sitting at the edge of his father's bed, talking to him quietly. Ivy was standing by the window, her gaze distant, lost in thought. I hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, taking a deep breath as I prepared to check Mr. Bradford's vitals. It had become routine by now, a comforting familiarity that kept us grounded in the midst of the chaos. But as I adjusted the drip, something unexpected happened. I heard a soft sound, a breath, perhaps a groan, and looked up in surprise. Mr. Bradford's eyes were open, just slightly, and there was something in them, a flicker of awareness, a recognition of the voices around him. I glanced over at Matthew, who had stopped talking, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Dad," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Can you hear me?" I watched. my heart racing in my chest, as Mr. Bradford's eyes moved, slowly but unmistakably, in the direction of his son. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to send a wave of emotion surging through the room. I could see it in Matthew's face, the mixture of disbelief and joy. This wasn't just a hopeful fantasy. This was real. "Dad, if you can hear me," Matthew said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Please, just squeeze my hand. I need to know you're still here with me." And then, impossibly, Mr. Bradford's fingers twitched. And slowly, they wrapped around Matthew's hand. It wasn't a forceful grip, but it was deliberate. And it was enough. Tears sprang to Matthew's eyes as he stared at his father's hand. Unable to comprehend what was happening, Ivy stepped forward, her expression a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Dad," she whispered, her voice soft but trembling. "Please, don't leave us. We need you." For a moment, there was no response. Only the steady beep of the heart monitor and the sound of shallow breathing filling the room. I could feel the weight of the moment settling over us. This was it. This was the sign we had been waiting for. The breakthrough we hadn't dared hope for. Then, just as quickly as the moment began, it seemed to stall. Mr. Bradford's hand relaxed, the movement stopping as suddenly as it had started. For a heartbeat. No one spoke, as though we were all afraid to break the fragile silence. But Matthew didn't give up. He kept his father's hand in his voice steady despite the tremor that still lingered in it. "Dad, I know you can hear me," he said, his words full of quiet resolve. "I know you're still in there, and we're not going to give up on you." It was as if those words had unlocked something in Mr. Bradford. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his fingers began to move again, wrapping around Matthew's hand once more. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. But it was undeniable. This wasn't just a reflex. This was something more. I think he's responding," I said softly, my voice filled with awe. "This is the sign we've been waiting for." Ivy's eyes filled with tears as she looked at her father. "Dad, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, don't leave us." For a long moment, we all stood in stunned silence, watching Mr. Bradford's hand clasping his son's. There was no dramatic awakening, no sudden burst of speech or movement. But this was progress. This was hope. I took a step back, giving the family space to be with each other. I could see the depth of emotion on Ivy's face. The years of grief and uncertainty now coalescing into something else. It wasn't complete healing, but it was the beginning of something that would take time, but something that was undeniably real. It was a testament to the power of love, of family, of the human will to survive. For the first time in months, I felt the weight of the situation lift. Even if just a little. There were no guarantees, no promises of a full recovery. But this small miracle, this tiny, fragile moment, was enough to make me believe again. It was enough to make all the late nights, all the doubts, all the moments of despair worth it. We were on the right path. And as I watched the family come together around Mr. Bradford's bed, I knew that this was only the beginning of their journey. There was so much more ahead, more struggles, more moments of doubt, but also more victories. More signs of life. We would face it all together, step by step. And no matter how long it took, we would never stop fighting. We weren't just caring for a patient anymore. We were witnessing the rebirth of a family, the rekindling of a bond that had been strained by time and circumstance. And in that, I realized that, sometimes, the greatest miracles aren't the dramatic moments, but the quiet ones, the ones that come in the form of small, steady progress. And those, in their own way, were the most profound of all. As the days passed, Mr. Bradford continued to show signs of recovery, however slow, and the bond between him and his children grew stronger with each small victory. Matthew and Ivy learned to cherish every moment, embracing the fragile hope that had once seemed impossible. Together, they stood by their father, watching as he fought his way back, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of love. For me, this journey was not just about healing a patient, but about witnessing the profound transformations that can occur when we refuse to give up on each other. It was about believing in something greater than ourselves, something that transcends the limits of medicine. As Mr. Bradford's recovery unfolded, I knew that their story would be one I would never forget. The lessons of empathy, perseverance, and unconditional love resonated deeply within me, and I was reminded once again of why I had chosen this path: to fight for life, to never stop believing in the impossible. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring life stories. Your support keeps us motivated to share these touching and transformative narratives with you.